The sun blazed down on Scottsdale, Arizona, its relentless heat casting sharp reflections off the sleek, glass exterior of Sun Valley Motors. Jack Reynolds stepped out of his pickup truck, his boots crunching against the asphalt. The air smelled faintly of warm rubber and fresh coffee from a nearby cafe. He adjusted his red MAGA hat, a beacon of his beliefs, and took in the row of high-end vehicles, each polished to a mirror finish. But Jack wasn't here to buy a car. He was here to see how this dealership, a small but critical part of the company he owned, treated its customers. As he pushed open the glass doors, the cool blast of air conditioning hit him, carrying the faint scent of leather. The showroom was immaculate, almost clinical. Salespeople hovered near vehicles, their smiles wide and practiced. For a moment, no one noticed him. Jack's eyes lingered on a sleek black sports car gleaming under the spotlights. Then, a young salesman approached, his voice tinged with nervous energy. "Good morning, sir. Looking for anything in particular today?" Jack smiled faintly. "Just browsing for now." Before the conversation could progress, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, Jeremy. I'll handle this." Jack turned to see a man striding toward them, his name tag reading *Steve Harrison. Manager. Steve's suit was impeccably tailored, his expression cool and authoritative. His eyes flickered to Jack's hat, then back to his face, a shadow of irritation crossing his features. "Sir," Steve began, his tone polite but clipped, "I'm afraid we reserve our services for serious buyers." Jack raised an eyebrow, his smile fading. "And how do you know I'm not serious?" Steve's eyes narrowed slightly, though he kept his composure. "It's just a policy we have, to prioritize clientele who align with our dealership's values." Jack held Steve's gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Interesting policy," he said quietly. Then, with a slight nod, he turned his attention back to the cars, ignoring the tension that now hung in the air. Steve's polished shoes clicked against the tile floor as he followed Jack, his demeanor growing colder with each step. Jack moved deliberately, pausing to admire the luxury sedans and SUVs lined up under bright showroom lights. He didn't seem hurried or phased, but the tension in Steve's posture was hard to miss. "Sir," Steve said, stepping directly into Jack's path, his voice carrying a sharp edge now, the politeness replaced with thinly veiled impatience. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Jack stopped, tilting his head slightly. His gaze fell on Steve's name tag for a moment before meeting his eyes. "Leave?" Jack repeated, his tone calm but firm. "And why is that?" Steve crossed his arms. "It's obvious you're not here to make a purchase. We prefer to maintain an environment that aligns with the values of our clientele. Your attire," he added, glancing pointedly at Jack's hat, "doesn't quite reflect the image we uphold." The room grew quieter. A few staff members exchanged uncertain glances, while a couple browsing near the corner seemed suddenly interested in the unfolding exchange. Jack noticed the subtle shift, but his expression didn't waver. "I see," Jack replied, his voice steady. "And what image is that?" Steve hesitated for a fraction of a second, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "We cater to a more progressive, inclusive clientele. We try to avoid political distractions." Jack let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Progressive and inclusive, huh? Except for people who think differently." Steve straightened, his face flushing slightly. "Sir, this isn't a debate. I'm asking you to leave. If you'd like, I can recommend another dealership that might be a better fit." Jack studied Steve for a long moment, then glanced around the room. The young salesman who had initially greeted him, Jeremy, stood near the edge of the showroom, looking uncomfortable. Several other staff members avoided eye contact altogether. Without another word, Jack turned on his heel and walked toward the door. The silence in the room felt heavy. As he pushed through the glass doors and stepped back into the sunlight, Steve exhaled sharply, adjusting his tie as he turned back to the staff. "All right, let's get back to work," he snapped, his tone brisk. But there was an undercurrent of unease in his voice, as if he knew the encounter wasn't quite over. Outside, Jack stood by his truck, the sun glinting off the hood. He leaned against the driver's door for a moment, looking back at the showroom through the reflective glass. His face gave nothing away, but a spark of something determination, perhaps flashed in his eyes, before he climbed into the truck and drove away. The afternoon sun beat down on the Scottsdale streets as Jack's truck eased into traffic. Inside the dealership, however, the atmosphere was less radiant. Steve Harrison returned to his office, his sharp remarks lingering in the air like static. The rest of the staff carried on, though the energy in the room felt off. Jeremy, the young salesman, shuffled uneasily behind a desk, glancing periodically toward the showroom floor. Meanwhile, Jack wasn't far. Parking his truck at a nearby cafe, He decided to do something he often encouraged in his corporate philosophy: observe. Grabbing a coffee, he positioned himself at a shaded outdoor table with a clear view of the dealership. Inside, the staff interactions grew more telling by the minute. Steve resumed his managerial rounds, exchanging a few forced smiles with customers and barking orders at employees. At one point, Jeremy approached him hesitantly, clearly nervous. "Sir," Jeremy began, keeping his voice low, "was it really necessary to ask that gentleman to leave?" He seemed. Steve cut him off, his expression tightening. "Let me stop you right there, Jeremy. People like him," Steve made a dismissive gesture toward the direction Jack had left, "are not our target market. If you want to make it here, you'll have to understand the kind of clientele we prioritize. Am I clear?" Jeremy's face reddened as he nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." The exchange didn't go unnoticed by a few other employees, who whispered among themselves when Steve wasn't looking. It was clear that not everyone agreed with the manager's approach, but none of them had the courage to voice it. After all, Steve was known for running a tight ship on where dissent wasn't welcomed. Back at the cafe, Jack took another sip of his coffee, the bitterness complementing his thoughts. His years in the corporate world had taught him a lot about leadership, but this moment struck a personal chord. The biases Steve displayed weren't just about politics. They revealed a lack of professionalism and respect that could corrode an organization from within. Jack watched for nearly an hour, noting the subtle dynamics. Employees avoided prolonged eye contact with Steve, clearly wary of crossing him. Customers came and went, most receiving courteous treatment, though there was an unmistakable air of superficiality in the interactions. It was a showroom that valued image above all else, a value Jack found hollow. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jack pulled out his phone and made a call. "Darlene, it's me," he said, his tone measured. "Can you set up a conference call with the regional manager for Sun Valley Motors tomorrow morning? I've got some things to discuss." Darlene, his longtime assistant, didn't miss a beat. "Of course, Mr. Reynolds. Anything else you need?" Jack glanced back at the dealership one last time before starting his truck. "Just make sure they're ready for some tough questions." The call ended, and Jack drove away, leaving behind a building that felt far more fragile than it appeared. What he had seen today wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a deeper problem, a culture in need of a wake-up call. The following day arrived with a different kind of heat, not from the sun, but from the simmering tension at Sun Valley Motors. Jack had intentionally kept his schedule light, knowing the day would demand his full attention. As he prepared for the conference call, he couldn't help but reflect on what he'd witnessed. The dealership wasn't just failing customers, it was failing its people. At 10 a.m. sharp, Jack dialed into the call. The regional manager, Karen Bishop, was punctual as ever. Her voice came through clear and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds. I understand you wanted to discuss some observations regarding Sun Valley Motors." Jack leaned back in his chair, his tone calm but deliberate. "Good morning, Karen. Yes, I visited the Scottsdale dealership yesterday, as a customer." A brief pause followed. Karen's tone shifted slightly, curiosity evident. "I see. How was your experience?" "Let's just say it was enlightening," Jack replied. He recounted the events with precision, leaving out none of the details: the manager's dismissive attitude, the refusal of service, and the cultural dynamics he'd observed. His words were factual, but the weight behind them was impossible to miss. Karen listened intently, her silence punctuated by the occasional sound of a pen scratching against paper. When Jack finished, she cleared her throat. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm truly sorry to hear about your experience. This behavior is absolutely unacceptable. I'll address it immediately." Jack didn't respond right away. He let the moment hang in the air before speaking. "Karen, I need more than an apology. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture. What's happening at Sun Valley Motors isn't unique to Scottsdale, it's systemic." Karen hesitated, then sighed. "You're right. We've had complaints about that location before, but nothing quite like this. I'll launch a full review of their operations and—" Jack cut her off gently. "That won't be necessary. I'll be handling it personally." Karen's surprise was palpable, even over the phone. "You, sir?" "Yes," Jack said firmly. "I want to see how they respond when the CEO walks through the door, not as a stranger, but as their leader. I'll be there this afternoon. Make sure they're ready." Karen agreed, though her voice carried a mix of relief and apprehension. Jack ended the call, his resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't just going to confront Steve Harrison. He was going to set a standard for what the company represented. By 3 p.m., Jack's truck rolled into the dealership's parking lot once more. This time, he walked through the doors without hesitation, his hat still in place but his demeanor unmistakably authoritative. The staff looked up, their expressions ranging from confusion to mild panic. Jeremy froze mid-conversation, his face a picture of disbelief. Steve was the last to notice Jack's arrival. He emerged from his office with his usual air of confidence, only to stop dead in his tracks when he saw Jack. His face paled, the realization dawning slowly, but unmistakably. "Mr. Reynolds," Steve stammered, the earlier bravado gone in an instant. I didn't realize." Jack didn't let him finish. "We'll talk in your office," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Now." The staff watched in stunned silence as Jack followed Steve into the office, closing the door behind them. The air in the showroom was thick with speculation, but no one dared say a word. Inside, Jack took a seat across from Steve's desk, his expression calm but unreadable. "Do you know why I'm here?" he asked. Steve swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting nervously. I assume it's about yesterday." Jack leaned forward slightly. "It is. And it's about a lot more than that." Steve shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of Jack's presence pressing down on him. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I assure you, this isn't how we usually operate. Yesterday was an exception." Jack's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor giving way to a harder edge. "An exception? That's an interesting choice of words, Steve, because what I saw wasn't an exception. It was a reflection of how this dealership is run." Steve opened his mouth to respond, but Jack raised a hand, stopping him. "Let me make something very clear. I've spent decades building this company not just as a business, but as a standard of excellence. What I witnessed yesterday, your behavior, your attitude toward a potential customer wasn't just unprofessional. It was a complete betrayal of those values." Steve's face flushed red. "I didn't know who you were," he blurted out, desperation creeping into his voice. "If I had, I never would have." Jack cut him off sharply. "And that's exactly the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am. Every single person who walks through those doors deserves respect regardless of how they look, what they wear, or what you think of them." Steve looked down at his hands, unable to meet Jack's gaze. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Jack leaned back in his chair, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its gravity. "Do you know what your actions cost this dealership yesterday? Not just financially, but reputationally. You didn't just alienate me, you alienated every employee who saw what you did and every customer who felt the tension in that showroom." Steve finally looked up, his face a mix of shame and defiance. "With all due respect, sir, I was trying to uphold the image of this dealership. We have a reputation to protect." Jack shook his head, a faint look of disappointment crossing his face. "A reputation isn't built on exclusion, Steve. It's built on integrity. And yesterday, you showed none of it." The room fell silent again, the tension almost palpable. Jack let the moment sink in before continuing. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties. Karen Bishop will oversee the transition until a new manager is appointed." Steve's eyes widened in shock. "You're firing me? Just like that?" Jack stood, his expression resolute. "This isn't just about you, Steve. It's about setting a standard for everyone else. This company doesn't tolerate discrimination, and it certainly doesn't tolerate arrogance masquerading as leadership." Steve slumped back in his chair, his face pale. Jack turned to leave but paused at the door. "One last thing," he said, glancing back. "Take this as a lesson. Wherever you go next, remember, respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of any successful business and any decent human being." Without waiting for a response, Jack walked out of the office, leaving Steve to grapple with the weight of his actions. In the showroom, the staff looked up as Jack emerged, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe. Jack addressed them directly, his voice steady and commanding. "I want all of you to know something. This dealership and this company stand for respect, professionalism, and excellence. If any of you feel those values aren't being upheld, you have my direct line. I expect nothing less than your full commitment to these principles." Jeremy, standing near the back, looked particularly relieved. Jack gave him a small nod before heading toward the door. As Jack stepped into the bright Arizona sunlight, he felt a sense of purpose. The dealership would recover. More importantly, the lessons learned here would ripple throughout the company, ensuring that no customer, no matter who they were, would ever be treated that way again. News of the sudden managerial change spread quickly among the employees. Whispers and exchanged glances filled the air as the staff began to process what had just happened. For some, it was a moment of vindication, a long overdue correction to a toxic environment. For others, it was a stark reminder that no one was above accountability. By the end of the day, Karen Bishop arrived at the dealership to meet with the staff. Standing in the center of the showroom, she addressed them with a mix of empathy and firmness. "Today marks a turning point for this dealership," she began. "We're here to rebuild, to focus on what matters most, our customers and each other. This is not just about making sales, it's about creating an environment of respect, trust, and professionalism." Her words resonated with Jeremy, who had spent the last few hours replaying the previous day's events in his mind. He stepped forward, hesitant but determined. "I'd like to say something," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Karen nodded, encouraging him to speak. Jeremy took a deep breath. "I've worked here for over a year, and I've seen firsthand how much Steve's attitude affected everyone, customers and staff alike. Yesterday was hard to watch, but seeing Mr. Reynolds step in like that, it gives me hope that things can change." Karen smiled warmly, her approval clear. "Thank you, Jeremy. Change starts with people like you, those willing to speak up and hold the line when things go wrong." Over the next few weeks, the dealership underwent significant changes. Karen implemented a series of training sessions focused on customer service, cultural sensitivity, and team collaboration. The staff began to bond in ways they hadn't before, breaking down barriers that Steve's leadership had reinforced. Jeremy emerged as a natural leader among his peers. His willingness to stand up for what was right didn't go unnoticed, and Karen took him under her wing, mentoring him on management principles. Within months, Jeremy was promoted to assistant manager, a role he approached with humility and determination. Meanwhile, Steve's dismissal sent a ripple through the company. Other dealerships in the chain took notice, leading to a company-wide initiative spearheaded by Jack himself. Workshops, town halls, and anonymous feedback channels were introduced, ensuring that every employee from entry-level to executive felt heard and valued. Asterisk as for Jack, he continued his unannounced visits to dealerships across the country. Each time, he reinforced the values that had driven his success. Though his encounters varied,